The day Lady Eleanor Ashford became the Duchess of Cavendish, she learned the cruelest truth of aristocratic England. A title could be bestowed with ink and ceremony, yet acceptance could be forever withheld. "You wear the coronet," Duke Sebastian Cavendish told her coldly on their wedding night, his grey eyes sharp as winter frost. "But you shall never wear my regard. This marriage is obligation, nothing more." 3 years passed in that magnificent prison of marble halls and silent dinners, 3 years of being invisible in plain sight, until the fever came. Until his children, desperate and tear-stained, ran through corridors their father forbade Eleanor to walk, crying, "Please, Duchess, please, only you can save him." If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Cavendish Manor, with the pale restraint typical of an English autumn, touching the Wedgwood blue walls of the Duchess's private sitting room with hesitant fingers. Lady Eleanor Ashford, now Eleanor Cavendish, Duchess of Cavendish, sat at her writing desk, the delicate chair seeming almost too fine for the weight of loneliness she carried. Outside, the sprawling grounds of the Derbyshire estate stretched toward distant hills, a landscape of manicured perfection that might have inspired poetry in another woman. In Eleanor, it inspired only a quiet, persistent ache. She was 23 years old, possessed of a gentle beauty that belonged more to wildflowers than hothouse roses. Chestnut hair that caught copper in sunlight, hazel eyes that shifted between green and gold depending on her mood, a slender frame that suggested fragility but concealed considerable strength of spirit. Her father, the late Viscount Ashford, had been a minor nobleman of modest means, his estate in Hertfordshire respectable but unremarkable. When he died suddenly of a heart ailment, leaving debts that threatened to consume what little remained, Eleanor's mother had made the calculations that desperate women of their class must make. The Duke of Cavendish needed a wife. His first Duchess had died 4 years prior, leaving him with 2 young children and a household that society whispered had descended into improper disorder. He was 35, wealthy beyond measure, and respected throughout England for his lineage and political influence. He was also, Eleanor learned too late, still deeply in love with his deceased wife. The marriage had been arranged with business-like efficiency. Eleanor's mother, Lady Ashford, had presented her daughter's virtues with the practiced skill of a merchant displaying fine goods. Eleanor was educated, accomplished in music and languages, biddable, healthy, and young enough to provide additional heirs if required. The Duke, for his part, required only that his new Duchess be respectable, capable of managing his household, and willing to accept a marriage of pure convenience. Love was not discussed, affection was not promised. Eleanor had accepted because she had no choice. The alternative was penury, perhaps even the workhouse for her mother. She told herself that duty could be its own reward, that she might find purpose in caring for the Duke's children, that respect could eventually kindle into something warmer. How naive she had been. The wedding took place on a grey October morning at the Duke's private chapel, a small gathering of family and close associates bearing witness to the union. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered, the ivory silk feeling like a shroud as she walked down the aisle. Duke Sebastian Cavendish stood at the altar in impeccable mourning dress, his tall frame rigid, his handsome face, all sharp cheekbones and aristocratic angles, set in an expression of remote courtesy. When he took her hand for the vows, his fingers were cold. That evening, after the brief wedding breakfast and the departure of guests, he summoned her to the library. The room was magnificent. 2 stories of book-lined walls reaching toward a coffered ceiling, leather chairs arranged before a massive fireplace where flames crackled with false warmth. The Duke stood with his back to the fire, his hands clasped behind him, and delivered the speech that would define their marriage. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice measured and inflectionless, I wish to establish the terms of our arrangement clearly, so there can be no misunderstanding. You are now the Duchess of Cavendish in law and in name. You will manage this household, serve as hostess when required, and conduct yourself with the dignity befitting your position. In return, you shall have financial security, social standing, and my protection." Eleanor stood before him, still in her wedding gown, feeling something inside her wither. "And what of companionship, Your Grace? What of partnership?" His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I had a partner, madam. I had a companion. Her name was Catherine, and she was the love of my life. When she died, that part of me died with her. I do not expect you to understand, but I require you to accept. You are my wife in name and necessity, nothing more." "And your children?" Eleanor asked quietly, thinking of the little girl and boy she had barely met. "Am I to be a mother to them? They have nurses and tutors. You need only ensure the household runs smoothly. Lady Catherine's memory is sacred to them. I will not have you attempting to replace her." The words landed like blows, each one precisely aimed. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, summoning what remained of her dignity. "I understand, Your Grace. I shall not trouble you with expectations beyond those you have stated." Something flickered in his grey eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval of her composure. "Then we are agreed. You may retire. I have work to attend to." And that was 3 years ago. In the time since, Eleanor had inhabited Cavendish Manor like a well-dressed ghost, present but never seen, dutiful but never acknowledged. She managed the household with quiet competence, kept the accounts, supervised the staff, ensured that every meal was perfect and every room immaculate. The Duke acknowledged her efforts with curt nods at best, complete indifference at worst. They took meals in the same room but rarely spoke beyond necessities. At night, they retired to separate bedchambers on opposite ends of the ducal wing. The children, Lady Charlotte, now 10, and Lord Thomas, 8, were polite strangers. Their late mother's portrait hung in the main hall, a beautiful woman with golden hair and laughing blue eyes, and the children were encouraged to speak to it daily, to remember her perfection. Eleanor was not permitted to accompany them on these rituals. When she encountered Charlotte and Thomas in the corridors, they would curtsy and bow respectfully, call her Your Grace with careful formality, and hurry away as if afraid that proximity might somehow betray their mother's memory. Eleanor bore it all with outward grace, but the loneliness carved hollow spaces inside her. She wrote letters to her mother, who now lived comfortably in Bath thanks to the Duke's financial settlement. She read voraciously from the library the Duke never knew she used. She walked the grounds alone, always alone, finding solace in the ancient oak trees and wild gardens beyond the manicured lawns. Society saw only what the Duke allowed them to see. A proper duchess, young and dutiful, who kept to herself and caused no scandal. At the rare social functions she attended, other ladies watched her with a mixture of pity and puzzlement. The Duke of Cavendish was known to be devoted to his late wife's memory, they whispered behind fans. But surely 3 years was long enough to allow his new Duchess some measure of regard. It was odd, quite odd, but then great men were permitted their eccentricities. On this particular October morning, Eleanor had received a letter from her mother, full of cheerful gossip about Bath society and gentle inquiries about Eleanor's happiness. How could she tell her mother the truth, that she lived in magnificent isolation, that her husband barely looked at her, that she had everything except the one thing she craved, to be seen, to matter, to be more than an efficient replacement for a beloved ghost? A knock at the door interrupted her melancholy thoughts. "Enter," she called, folding the letter away. Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, appeared, a stout woman of 50, with iron-grey hair and a face that had long ago settled into professional neutrality. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but His Grace has requested your presence in his study." Eleanor's heart skipped. The Duke summoned her perhaps once a month, usually regarding household matters that required his approval. Of course. Please tell his grace I shall attend him shortly. Ugly, as she prepared herself, checking her appearance in the mirror, a simple morning dress of dove grey, her hair arranged in a modest chignon, Eleanor wondered what administrative matter required discussion today. Budget approvals, perhaps, or arrangements for the upcoming Christmas season. She could not have imagined that this ordinary summons would mark the beginning of everything changing, that within a fortnight the carefully constructed walls of her golden cage would begin to crack, and through those cracks something unexpected would finally have room to grow. The Duke's study was a masculine sanctuary of dark wood panelling and leather, smelling of tobacco and old books. A room Eleanor had entered perhaps a dozen times in 3 years of marriage. Duke Sebastian Cavendish stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the pale morning light, hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic posture of authority. He did not turn when Eleanor entered. "Your Grace," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "You wished to see me?" "I did." His voice was clipped, businesslike. He turned finally, and Eleanor was struck, as she always was, by the austere handsomeness of his face, the sharp jaw, the high cheekbones, the grey eyes that could have been beautiful if they held any warmth. "I am hosting a house party in 3 weeks' time. Political associates primarily, Lord Ashworth, the Earl of Darlington, several members of Parliament. It is essential for certain legislation I am advancing." Eleanor nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. I shall make all necessary arrangements." "How many guests should I prepare for?" 20, perhaps 25. They will stay for a week." He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Lady Ashworth will be among them." The name sent a chill through Eleanor's chest. Lady Victoria Ashworth, widow of the late Baron Ashworth, was known throughout society as a woman of extraordinary beauty and sharp intelligence. She was also, Eleanor had learned through careful observation at social functions, the object of considerable speculation regarding the Duke's affections. They had known each other since childhood, some said. She had been Catherine's dearest friend. Others whispered that the Duke might have married Victoria instead, had circumstances been different. "I understand," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "I shall ensure Lady Ashworth is given accommodations befitting her status." Something flickered in the Duke's expression. Annoyance, perhaps, that Eleanor showed no reaction beyond professional competence. "The blue suite," he said curtly. It was Catherine's favourite for guests. Of course it was. Everything came back to Catherine. "As you wish, Your Grace. Will there be anything else?" "No, you may go." Eleanor curtsied and withdrew, her mind already organising the endless tasks required for such an event. A week-long house party for 25 distinguished guests meant coordinating meals, entertainments, sleeping arrangements, servant schedules, and 1,000 other details. It would consume all her time and attention. Good. Perhaps exhaustion would dull the anxiety that had settled in her stomach at the mention of Lady Ashworth's name. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor threw herself into the work with fierce determination, consulting with the cook about elaborate menus, ensuring every guest room was perfected, arranging for musicians and card tables and hunting expeditions. The Duke reviewed her plans with grudging approval, offering occasional terse corrections, but mostly leaving her to manage the details. On the day of the guests' arrival, Cavendish Manor gleamed with polish and preparation. Fires crackled in every hearth, flowers adorned every room, the silver gleamed, and the servants stood ready in crisp uniforms. Eleanor dressed with particular care in a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the gold in her hazel eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant style that her lady's maid had laboured over for an hour. If she must play hostess to her husband's probable paramour, she would at least do so with dignity. The carriages began arriving in the afternoon. Eleanor stood beside the Duke in the grand entrance hall, a picture of ducal unity that was entirely false. He acknowledged each guest with grave courtesy, while Eleanor smiled and welcomed them with practised warmth. Lords and ladies, politicians and their wives, all bringing with them the sophisticated chatter of London society. And then Lady Victoria Ashworth arrived. She descended from her carriage like a vision from a romance novel, tall and willowy, with pale blonde hair and blue eyes, features so perfectly proportioned they seemed almost unreal. Her travelling costume was the latest Paris fashion, her bearing confident and aristocratic. When she saw the Duke, her face lit with genuine pleasure. "Sebastian," she said warmly, extending her hands. The use of his Christian name was telling. "How wonderful to see you again." The Duke took her hands, and Eleanor saw something she had never seen in 3 years of marriage. He smiled. Not the tight, polite expression he offered society, but a real smile that softened his harsh features and reached his eyes. "Victoria, thank you for coming. It has been too long, far too long," Victoria agreed, then turned her gaze to Eleanor with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And this must be the new Duchess. How charming. You're even younger than I expected." No, the words were courteous, but the dismissive tone cut like a blade. Eleanor curtsied slightly. "Lady Ashworth, welcome to Cavendish Manor. I hope your journey was pleasant." "Pleasant enough." Victoria turned back to the Duke, effectively dismissing Eleanor. "You must tell me all about this bill you're championing. I've read the proposals, and I have thoughts." They walked into the manor together, deep in conversation, while Eleanor stood frozen in the entrance hall, feeling like a servant who had overstepped. The other guests filed past her with curious glances, but she barely noticed, her mind reeling from the casual cruelty of being rendered invisible in her own home. The week that followed was exquisite torture. During the day, Eleanor performed her duties flawlessly, ensuring meals were served on time, organizing entertainment, managing every detail of the household. But she could not help but notice how the Duke gravitated toward Victoria, how they spent hours in conversation, how he laughed at her witticisms and sought her opinion on political matters. At dinner, Victoria was seated at his right hand, while Eleanor presided from the far end of the long table, miles away. During evening entertainments, they played cards together or discussed books, while Eleanor made polite conversation with other guests who clearly wondered at the strange dynamic. The children, Charlotte and Thomas, who usually kept their distance from Eleanor, seemed drawn to Victoria. Eleanor overheard them calling her Aunt Victoria, saw how she embraced them with easy affection, told them stories about their mother that made them laugh and cry. On the 5th night of the party, disaster struck. Eleanor had arranged for dancing in the ballroom, hiring musicians from Derby to provide entertainment. The guests were in high spirits, the champagne flowing freely, couples whirling across the polished floor. The Duke opened the dancing with Victoria, the two of them moving together with practiced ease, a striking pair that drew every eye. Eleanor danced dutifully with various gentlemen, maintaining her hostess smile while her heart cracked with each breath. Then Lord Darlington, slightly drunk and clearly malicious, approached her during a break in the music. "Tell me, Your Grace," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "what is it like being married to a man who keeps his late wife's portrait above his bed and spends his evenings wooing her best friend?" The ballroom seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The musicians' instruments fell silent. Every face turned toward Eleanor and Lord Darlington, then toward the Duke and Victoria, who stood frozen near the refreshment table. Eleanor felt blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The humiliation was absolute. The speculation she had endured in silence now spoken aloud for everyone to witness. The Duke's face went rigid with fury, but it was not directed at Lord Darlington. His cold grey eyes fixed on Eleanor as if she had somehow caused this scene, as if her mere existence was an embarrassment. "This entertainment has concluded," he announced in a voice like winter itself. "I bid you all good night." The guests began to disperse awkwardly, whispering behind their hands. Victoria touched the Duke's arm with proprietary concern, murmuring something Eleanor couldn't hear. Charlotte and Thomas, who had been allowed to watch the dancing, stared at Eleanor with something like accusation, as if she had ruined their evening and disrespected their mother's memory by even being present. Eleanor fled. She lifted her skirts and walked, not ran. She retained that much dignity, from the ballroom, through the corridors, out into the night garden, where the October air was sharp and cold. Behind her, she heard the Duke's voice calling her name, but she couldn't face him, couldn't bear whatever cold reprimand he would deliver. She found herself in the wild garden beyond the manicured grounds, among the ancient oaks and overgrown paths where no one ever came. There, finally, she allowed herself to weep, great wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. 3 years of enduring indifference, of being a shadow in her own home, of watching her husband openly prefer another woman, of being nothing more than an efficient administrator with a title she could never truly claim. "You are a duchess only on paper," the Duke had told her. Tonight, society had learned that truth. Tonight, her humiliation was complete. She didn't return to the manor until dawn, her eyes swollen, her gown stained with dew and dirt, her hair disheveled. The house party would continue for 2 more days, but Eleanor no longer cared. She had reached the limit of what duty could demand. Something inside her, something that had bent and bent under the weight of neglect, had finally broken. By the time the guests departed, Eleanor had made her decision. She would write to her mother in Bath. She would ask for refuge. She could not continue living as a ghost, could not spend her life loving a man who looked through her as if she weren't there. The marriage was legal and permanent, but surely she could live quietly elsewhere, could release the Duke to pursue Victoria without the inconvenience of an unwanted wife in residence. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 3 days after the last guest departed, the fever came to Cavendish Manor, and everything Eleanor thought she knew about duty, about love, about her place in this cold house would be overturned. The morning after the last guest departed, Eleanor woke in her isolated bedchamber, feeling hollowed out, as if the humiliation of the house party had scraped away everything inside her, except a dull, persistent ache. She rose mechanically, dressed in a simple morning gown without calling for her maid, and sat at her writing desk to compose the letter she had been drafting in her mind through the sleepless night. "Dearest Mamma," she wrote, her hand trembling slightly, "I find that I must impose upon your hospitality. Circumstances at Cavendish Manor have become untenable, and while I cannot abandon my legal obligations entirely, I believe a period of separation might prove beneficial to all parties. I shall arrive in Bath by the end of the month, if you will have me." She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, before duty or pride or stubborn hope could change her mind. She would maintain the appearance of propriety, a duchess visiting her mother for health reasons, perhaps. The Duke would likely be relieved to have her gone. He could pursue Victoria openly then, could stop pretending even the minimal civility their public appearances required. Eleanor rang for a servant to post the letter, then steeled herself for another day of managing a household where she existed only as a function, never as a person. But the day brought unexpected disruption. By mid-morning, word reached Eleanor through Mrs. Hendricks that young Lord Thomas had taken ill. Nothing serious, the doctor assured, merely a mild fever and cough, common in children during autumn. The boy was confined to the nursery with strict instructions to rest. Lady Charlotte, ever protective of her younger brother, refused to leave his side. Eleanor, who had been carefully excluded from the children's lives, felt an unexpected pang of concern. "Please inform Nurse Patricia that she may call upon me if anything is needed," she told Mrs. Hendricks. The housekeeper's expression flickered with something like sympathy. "Of course, Your Grace." The Duke, meanwhile, had withdrawn to his study, where he spent most of his time when not in London attending to political affairs. Eleanor had not seen him since the disastrous ball, and she had no desire to remedy that situation. Let him brood over his papers and his late wife's memory. Eleanor was done trying to exist in the margins of his grief. 3 days passed in this tense quiet. Thomas's fever broke, and he began to recover, much to everyone's relief. Eleanor went about her duties with mechanical efficiency, counting down the days until her mother's reply would arrive, and she could escape this mausoleum of a marriage. On the fourth day, the Duke summoned her to his study. Eleanor's heart sank, but she went dutifully, bracing herself for whatever cold reprimand he intended to deliver about the house party's disastrous conclusion. She found him standing by the window as always, but something was different. His posture lacked its usual rigid control. When he turned, she noticed dark circles under his eyes, a slight pallor to his complexion. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "you wish to see me?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Lord Darlington's behavior was unconscionable. I should have defended you immediately rather than—" He paused, jaw tightening. "Rather than allowing my own discomfort to dictate my response." Eleanor stood very still, shocked. An apology. In 3 years, he had never apologized for anything. "I thank you, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he said quietly. "My name is Sebastian. You are my wife. You need not address me with such formality in private." This was so unexpected that Eleanor couldn't quite process it. "As you wish, Sebastian." He nodded, then winced slightly, raising a hand to his temple. "I wanted you to know that I sent Lord Darlington a very clear message regarding his conduct. He will not be welcome at Cavendish Manor again." Another pause. "And I wanted to... that is, I have been thinking about certain things Victoria said before she departed." Victoria. Of course. Even his apology was prompted by her influence. Eleanor felt the brief flicker of hope die before it could fully ignite. "I see. She told me that I have been unfair to you, that Catherine would have been appalled by how I've treated you." His voice was rough, almost angry, but Eleanor sensed the anger was directed inward. She was right. "I have allowed my grief to make me cruel. That was never my intention. But intention matters little when the harm is done." Eleanor didn't trust her voice, so she simply nodded. Sebastian swayed slightly, catching himself against the desk. "Forgive me. I find I'm not feeling entirely well. Thomas's illness, perhaps. I should—" He didn't finish the sentence. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed. Eleanor cried out, rushing forward to kneel beside him. His skin was burning hot, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Mrs. Hendricks!" she screamed. "Mrs. Hendricks, quickly, send for the doctor. His Grace has fallen ill." The household erupted into organized chaos. Footmen carried the unconscious Duke to his bedchamber, the first time Eleanor had crossed that threshold in 3 years. The doctor was summoned from the village, arriving within the hour to examine the Duke with grave concern. "A severe fever," Dr. Whitmore announced, his elderly face creased with worry. "It seems His Grace contracted whatever illness young Lord Thomas suffered, but in adults, such fevers can be far more dangerous. The next few days will be critical." Eleanor stood at the foot of the massive 4-poster bed, staring at the man who had been a cold stranger for 3 years, now reduced to vulnerability by illness. Above the headboard hung the portrait of Catherine he had mentioned, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Even now, even like this, Catherine's presence dominated the room. "What must be done?" Eleanor asked the doctor. "What treatment is required?" Dr. Whitmore shook his head grimly. "Keep him cool, force fluids when he's conscious enough to drink and pray. Fevers such as this either break or they don't. There's little medicine can do except keep the patient comfortable." "Then I shall nurse him," Eleanor said firmly. "Instruct me in what I must do." The doctor looked surprised. "Your Grace, it would be more appropriate for the valet to—" "I am his wife," Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I shall care for him. Tell me what is needed." And so began the strangest week of Eleanor's life. She established herself in the Duke's bedchamber, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, waking every few hours to bathe his forehead with cool cloths, to coax water or broth past his lips during brief moments of semi-consciousness. The fever raged through him, turning his skin hot and dry, making him delirious. He called out for Catherine, wept for her, begged her forgiveness for things Eleanor didn't understand. It was agonizing to witness, to be present for such raw grief, to understand fully for the first time how completely Catherine had owned his heart. But Eleanor persisted. She sent away the servants who offered to relieve her, ignored Mrs. Hendricks's concerns about propriety and exhaustion. Something stubborn and fundamental in her refused to abandon him, even knowing he would never truly be hers, even knowing that when he recovered, they would return to their cold, formal distance. On the third day of the fever, Charlotte and Thomas appeared in the doorway of their father's bedchamber, their young faces pale and frightened. Eleanor had been so focused on Sebastian that she hadn't thought about how terrifying this must be for children who had already lost one parent. "Is Papa dying?" Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking. Eleanor set down the cloth she'd been using and went to them, kneeling so she was at their eye level. "Your father is very ill," she said gently, "but Dr. Whitmore says he is strong. We must have faith." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "We can't lose him too. We can't. Mama is already gone." Something in Eleanor's chest cracked open. She pulled both children into her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, they clung to her, sobbing against her shoulders. Eleanor held them tightly, stroking their hair, murmuring reassurances she wasn't certain were true, but that they desperately needed to hear. "I won't let anything happen to him," she heard herself promise. "I swear to you both, I will do everything in my power to bring your father back to you." From that moment, the children became her shadows. They sat quietly in corners of their father's bedchamber, watching Eleanor work with wide, anxious eyes. She explained what she was doing, the cool baths to bring down fever, the careful spoonfuls of water and broth, the constant vigilance. Charlotte began helping, fetching fresh cloths and water. Thomas read to his unconscious father from books of adventure stories, his young voice trembling but determined. On the fifth night, the fever reached its crisis point. Sebastian's temperature spiked dangerously high. His breathing became labored, and Dr. Whitmore arrived with a grave expression that said everything without words. The household staff gathered in hushed clusters, praying. Charlotte and Thomas sat huddled together on a settee, holding hands and watching their stepmother work with desperate hope in their eyes. Eleanor refused to surrender. She bathed Sebastian's burning skin with ice water brought from the cold cellar, held his head while forcing water between his cracked lips, spoke to him constantly, telling him about his children, about the estate, about everything he still had to live for. She didn't know if he could hear her through the delirium, but she kept talking anyway, as if her voice alone could tether him to life. "You cannot leave them," she whispered fiercely as dawn approached, her own exhaustion making her bold. "Charlotte and Thomas need you. You are their father, and they have already lost too much. You will fight this, Sebastian Cavendish. You will fight, and you will live." As the sun rose on the sixth day, something shifted. Sebastian's breathing eased slightly. His skin, while still hot, seemed less frighteningly so. Dr. Whitmore checked his pulse and allowed himself a cautious smile. "The fever is breaking," he announced. "Her Grace has performed a miracle." Eleanor sagged with relief, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, Charlotte and Thomas erupted into joyful sobs, flinging themselves at Eleanor in gratitude. For the first time since she had entered this house, the children embraced her not out of duty, but genuine feeling. Over the following days, as Sebastian slowly recovered consciousness and strength, something fundamental had changed. The children no longer kept their distance from Eleanor. They sought her out, called her Duchess with warmth rather than formality, asked her opinion on things. Charlotte confided that she had been afraid to like Eleanor because she thought it would betray her mother's memory. But watching Eleanor fight so fiercely for their father had shown her that love wasn't a finite resource, that honoring Catherine's memory didn't require rejecting Eleanor's care. When Sebastian was finally lucid enough to understand what had happened, Eleanor was sitting by his bedside, reading while Charlotte and Thomas did their lessons nearby. His grey eyes opened fully, focused, and found her face. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "the doctor tells me Tells me you saved my life." She set down her book, meeting his gaze steadily. "I did what any wife would do, but I have never been a husband to you." The words were raw with some emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Why would you—" "Because it was right," Eleanor interrupted quietly. "Because your children needed you. Because despite everything, I could not simply let you die." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Confusion, perhaps, or the first stirrings of actual awareness of her as a person rather than an inconvenient obligation. "I don't deserve such devotion." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "You don't, but they do." She gestured to Charlotte and Thomas, who had abandoned their lessons to hover anxiously nearby. "And they are reason enough." Sebastian's recovery was slow but steady. During those weeks of convalescence, Eleanor continued to care for him, not with a nurse's impersonal efficiency, but with genuine concern that surprised them both. They began, tentatively, to have actual conversations. He asked about her interests, discovered she read widely on political philosophy and had opinions on the legislation he championed. She learned about his childhood, his fears for his children, the crushing weight of grief that had made him retreat into coldness rather than face the pain of living. "Victoria told me something before she left," Sebastian said one afternoon, as Eleanor helped him walk slowly around his bedchamber to regain his strength. "She said that Catherine would have wanted me to be happy again, that I was dishonouring her memory by refusing to live. I was angry with her for saying it, but lying there in that fever, calling for Catherine, I heard her voice, or perhaps it was delirium, I don't know. But she told me the same thing. She said, 'Let me go, Sebastian. Let yourself live.'" Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she simply supported his weight and let him continue. "I have been monstrously unfair to you," he said quietly. "I brought you into a house of ghosts and expected you to be nothing more than another shadow. That was cruel." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, seeing no point in false modesty. "It was." He actually smiled slightly at her honesty. "I should like to try again, if you would permit it. I cannot promise love, Eleanor. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. But perhaps we might attempt friendship, partnership." It wasn't everything. It wasn't the romance Eleanor had once dreamed of in her girlish heart, but it was more than she'd had for 3 years, and it was, at least, honest. "I would like that," she said. As autumn deepened toward winter, Cavendish Manor began to feel different to Eleanor. The children sought her company openly now, asking her to read to them or help with their studies. Sebastian joined the family for meals, and their conversations ranged from books to politics to estate matters, discovering shared interests they'd never explored before. The servants, seeing the shift in dynamics, began treating Eleanor with warmer respect. And Eleanor, who had written that letter to her mother begging for escape, sent a different message instead. "All is well. There is no need for concern. I am finding my place here at last." She didn't fool herself that everything was resolved. The portrait of Catherine still hung above Sebastian's bed. He still had moments of retreating into grief. But something had cracked open between them, some possibility that hadn't existed before. Eleanor had proven herself not merely dutiful, but essential. She had saved his life, had cared for his children, had shown a strength and devotion he hadn't known to look for. It wasn't love yet, but it was, perhaps, the foundation upon which something genuine might eventually be built. And for Eleanor, who had spent 3 years as a duchess only on paper, that small beginning felt like a quiet revolution. Winter settled over Derbyshire with characteristic English restraint, no dramatic blizzards, but rather a persistent cold damp that seeped into bones and stone alike. Cavendish Manor, however, seemed warmer than Eleanor had ever known it. Fires crackled in every room, yes, but more than that, there was a thaw in the atmosphere itself, as if Sebastian's near death had melted something frozen within the walls. It was now early December, 6 weeks since the fever had nearly claimed the Duke. Sebastian had recovered fully, his strength returned, though something in his demeanour remained altered. He was less rigid, more present. He sought Eleanor's company now, not out of obligation, but seemingly genuine interest. They took breakfast together, discussing the day's plans. He asked her opinion on estate matters, listened thoughtfully, often implemented her suggestions. In the evenings, they sat together in the drawing room, while Charlotte practiced pianoforte and Thomas read aloud from adventure novels, creating a portrait of family that had never existed in this house before. Eleanor found herself cautiously hopeful, though she guarded her heart carefully. Sebastian was kinder, attentive even, but he had not removed Catherine's portrait from his bedchamber. He spoke of his late wife less frequently, but still visited her memorial in the family chapel every Sunday without fail. Eleanor understood. She didn't expect to replace Catherine, didn't even want to, but she hoped, quietly, that perhaps she might carve out her own space in his regard, something that belonged to her alone. The children, at least, had fully accepted her. Charlotte now called her Duchess Eleanor with warmth and confided in her about lessons and friendships and her dreams for the future. Thomas followed Eleanor around like a devoted puppy, chattering about horses and soldiers and asking endless questions about everything under the sun. When Sebastian observed these interactions, Eleanor sometimes caught an expression on his face she couldn't quite interpret. Surprise, perhaps, or something softer, more thoughtful. The fragile peace was shattered by an unexpected letter. It arrived on a grey December morning, delivered by special messenger. Eleanor was in the morning room reviewing menus with the cook when Mrs. Hendricks appeared with the silver salver bearing the cream-coloured envelope, sealed with an elaborate crest. "For His Grace from London," the housekeeper announced. The messenger said it was urgent. Sebastian was in his study. Eleanor took the letter herself, knocking on his door and entering when he called permission. He looked up from the papers scattered across his massive desk, his expression softening when he saw her, a response that still surprised and pleased her. "A letter marked urgent," Eleanor said, handing it to him. He broke the seal, scanned the contents, and his face went carefully blank. "It seems I'm required in London for the parliamentary session earlier than anticipated. There's a crucial vote on the reform bill I've been championing. I'll need to depart within the week and remain through Christmas, likely into the new year." Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment. They had only just begun to build something resembling a real marriage, and now he would be gone for weeks. "Of course, I'll instruct Mrs. Hendricks to prepare for your departure." Sebastian hesitated, then said carefully, "There will be a series of social functions associated with the parliamentary session. Dinners, receptions, a grand ball at year's end. It would be appropriate for the Duchess to attend, if you wish to accompany me to London." Eleanor's heart leaped. In 3 years of marriage, Sebastian had never invited her to accompany him to London. She had remained at Cavendish Manor like a housekeeper with a courtesy title, while he managed his political life separately. "You wish me to come?" "I do." He stood, moving around the desk to face her directly. "Eleanor, I know I have kept you separate for much of my life. That was wrong. You are my wife. You should be at my side, not hidden away in the country. If you're willing to tolerate London society and all its tedious demands, I would be glad of your company." "Then I shall come," Eleanor said, unable to suppress a smile. They departed for London 5 days later, the children remaining at Cavendish Manor in the care of their nurses and tutors, though Charlotte extracted promises that Eleanor would write often and bring back gifts. The journey took 2 days, and Eleanor used the time to study Sebastian's notes on the reform bill, wanting to understand the political issues she would undoubtedly hear debated. Sebastian, for his part, seemed pleased by her interest, explaining the complex legislative maneuvering with enthusiasm. "Most ladies find political discussion tedious," he observed. "Most ladies are not permitted education beyond accomplishments meant to attract husbands," Eleanor replied dryly. "I find politics fascinating. The ability to shape society through law is perhaps the greatest responsibility of your class. I should think every duchess would want to understand such things." He looked at her with something approaching admiration. Catherine used to say much the same thing. The mention of Catherine sent a small chill through Eleanor's warmth, but she pushed it aside. She was tired of competing with a ghost. She would simply be herself, and let that be sufficient or not. The London house was a magnificent townhouse in Mayfair, all elegant proportions and fashionable furnishings. Eleanor had seen it only once, briefly, just after their marriage. Now she would be mistress here, as she was at Cavendish Manor. The staff assembled to greet them, and Eleanor was introduced to Mrs. Pemberton, the London housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman who assessed the Duchess with careful scrutiny. "I trust we shall work well together," Eleanor said pleasantly, but with unmistakable authority. "I shall wish to review the household accounts and meet with you daily to coordinate His Grace's schedule." Mrs. Pemberton's expression shifted to respect. "Of course, Your Grace. I shall have the books ready for your inspection." The parliamentary session and its associated social season descended upon them like a whirlwind. Eleanor found herself thrust into a world she'd only glimpsed peripherally, glittering receptions where political power was traded over champagne, intimate dinners where legislation was debated between courses, grand balls where alliances were formed on the dance floor. She moved through it all with natural grace, her intelligence and genuine interest in the issues making her a more compelling presence than society expected. Women who had dismissed her as the Duke's quiet country wife were surprised to find the Duchess of Cavendish could hold her own in conversations about parliamentary reform, economic policy, and social justice. Men who had ignored her discovered she could discuss the reform bill's implications with nuanced understanding. Sebastian, observing this, seemed both surprised and impressed. "You're a natural at this," he told her after one particularly successful dinner party where Eleanor had charmed a crucial undecided lord into supporting Sebastian's position. "I've never seen Lord Chiswick so thoroughly persuaded to anything," Eleanor smiled. "I simply listened to his concerns and showed him how the bill addressed them. Men of his generation appreciate being heard, not lectured." "Where did you learn such diplomatic skill?" "From being invisible for 3 years, Eleanor said, her tone light but with an edge. "When no one notices you, you learn to observe very carefully. You learn what motivates people, what they fear, what they desire." Sebastian had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Eleanor, it's all right," she interrupted. "That time is past. Let us focus on the present." But the present became complicated when, at a grand reception at Lord Chancellor's residence, Eleanor encountered Lady Victoria Ashworth. Victoria looked stunning, as always, draped in silver silk that complemented her blonde beauty, surrounded by a circle of admirers. When she spotted Sebastian and Eleanor entering together, her blue eyes widened with surprise that quickly morphed into something harder to read. "Sebastian," she said warmly, approaching them with hands extended. "What a delightful surprise! I had no idea you'd brought your Duchess to town." "Victoria." Sebastian took her hands briefly, politely, but Eleanor noted he released them quickly. "Yes, Eleanor will be attending the season's functions with me." "How domestic," Victoria said, turning her assessing gaze on Eleanor. "The little Duchess has emerged from the country. How brave of you, my dear, to venture into London society. It can be quite overwhelming for those unaccustomed to it." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor met Victoria's gaze evenly, refusing to be cowed. "I'm finding it invigorating, actually. There's so much meaningful discussion happening. The reform bill, for instance. I understand you have opinions on it." Victoria's smile tightened. "I concern myself with many important matters, yes." "Then perhaps we might discuss it sometime," Eleanor suggested pleasantly. "I'd be interested in your perspective, particularly on the education provisions. I believe ensuring broader access to education is crucial for the bill's long-term success." For a moment, Victoria seemed at a loss for words, clearly not expecting the quiet Duchess to engage substantively. Yes, well, perhaps." Sebastian, Eleanor noticed, was watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement. "If you'll excuse us, Victoria, I see Lord Ashworth has arrived, and I need to speak with him about the vote schedule." As they moved away, Sebastian murmured near Eleanor's ear, "That was masterfully done." "Was it?" Eleanor asked innocently. "You know it was. Victoria is accustomed to being the most formidable woman in any room. You just challenged that assumption without ever being overtly rude. Brilliant." The warmth in his voice sent pleasure through Eleanor's chest. For the first time since their marriage, she felt like a true partner to him, standing at his side as an equal, rather than trailing behind as an afterthought. But Victoria, Eleanor soon discovered, was not accustomed to being outshone, and she had no intention of ceding territory gracefully. At subsequent functions, Victoria made pointed comments about Catherine, how beautiful she'd been, how accomplished, how beloved by all who knew her. She told stories that highlighted Catherine's perfection and implicitly emphasized Eleanor's inability to match such a standard. She inserted herself into conversations between Sebastian and Eleanor, redirecting his attention with practiced ease. The rivalry that emerged was subtle, conducted with the weapons of English propriety, cutting remarks disguised as compliments, territorial displays masked as friendly concern, constant reminders that Eleanor was the replacement, not the original love. Eleanor refused to engage directly. Instead, she simply continued being herself, intelligent, compassionate, genuinely interested in the people around her and the issues being debated. She won allies through authenticity rather than manipulation. And slowly, London society began to notice. The turning point came at the grand Yuletide ball hosted by the Duchess of Marlborough at her magnificent estate. It was the social event of the season, attended by everyone who mattered in London society. Eleanor dressed with particular care in a gown of deep sapphire silk that transformed her hazel eyes to brilliant green, her chestnut hair arranged in an elaborate style woven with pearls. When she descended the stairs to meet Sebastian, she saw his eyes widen with unmistakable appreciation. "You look breathtaking," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, pleased by the genuine warmth in his voice. The ballroom was a fantasy of candlelight and winter flowers, hundreds of guests swirling in elaborate dances. Eleanor danced first with Sebastian, and for the first time she felt truly connected to him. His hand warm on her waist, his eyes holding hers, a small smile playing at his lips. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked as they moved through the waltz. "I am," Eleanor said honestly. "More than I expected." "Good. You deserve enjoyment, Eleanor. You deserve many things I haven't given you." Before she could respond, the dance ended, and other partners claimed her attention. Eleanor danced with lords and ministers, charmed diplomats and merchants, her natural grace and intelligent conversation making her the subject of considerable positive attention. She was catching her breath near the refreshment table when Victoria appeared beside her, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "You seem to be quite the success," Victoria observed, offering 1 glass to Eleanor. "Thank you." Eleanor accepted the champagne cautiously. "Tell me," Victoria said, her voice low and sharp, "do you truly believe Sebastian cares for you? Or have you simply made yourself useful enough that he tolerates your presence?" Eleanor took a sip of champagne, considering her response. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "I believe Sebastian and I are building something genuine. It may not be what he had with Catherine, but it doesn't need to be. Their love was its own thing. What we're creating is ours." "How sweet," Victoria said mockingly. "The little replacement believes she's becoming real. But tell me, Eleanor, has he removed Catherine's portrait from above his bed? Does he call for you in the night, or does he still whisper her name?" The words stung because they touched on Eleanor's own insecurities, but she refused to let Victoria see her waver. "My marriage is my own business, Lady Ashworth, and I suggest you concern yourself with your own affairs rather than mine." Victoria's face hardened. "You think you've won because he's paying attention to you? You're a convenience, nothing more. Sebastian will always love Catherine. When he looks at you, he sees only what you're not. Perhaps Eleanor acknowledged quietly. "But when I look at him, I see a man capable of healing, capable of change, capable of building a future instead of living in the past. And I believe, given time, he will see that too." Before Victoria could respond, Sebastian appeared at Eleanor's side. "There you are. They're about to announce the supper pairings, and I specifically requested we be seated together." Eleanor set down her champagne glass and took his offered arm, leaving Victoria standing alone with her venom. As they walked into the supper room, Sebastian leaned close and whispered, "I saw you speaking with Victoria. She didn't upset you, I hope?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Eleanor assured him. The supper was a triumph. Eleanor was seated between Sebastian and Lord Chancellor himself, and her thoughtful contributions to the political discussion impressed everyone present. Several lords approached Sebastian afterward to compliment him on his Duchess's intelligence and grace. As they rode home in their carriage through London's lamp-lit streets, Sebastian took Eleanor's hand, the first truly intimate gesture he'd initiated since his illness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being remarkable, for making me remember that life continues, that there are possibilities I'd stopped allowing myself to imagine." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. "Sebastian, I'm not ready yet," he interrupted gently. "I need you to know that. I'm not ready to let go of Catherine's memory completely, not ready to offer you everything you deserve. But I'm trying, Eleanor. I'm truly trying." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even close, but it was honest, and it was movement. And for Eleanor, who had spent 3 years as a duchess only on paper, it felt like everything. The parliamentary vote on the reform bill took place on a bitter January morning, with snow falling softly over London's grey streets. Eleanor sat in the ladies' gallery of the House of Lords, one of the few women present, watching as Sebastian rose to give his closing argument before the vote. His voice rang through the chamber with passionate conviction as he spoke of justice, opportunity, and England's duty to its citizens. When the vote was called, Eleanor found herself holding her breath. The reform bill passed by a narrow margin, and the chamber erupted in applause and protest in equal measure. Sebastian's eyes found hers in the gallery, and she saw triumph there and gratitude, and something else she didn't dare name. That evening, there was a celebratory dinner at the Cavendish townhouse for those lords and ministers who had supported the bill. Eleanor orchestrated it flawlessly, presiding over the gathering with confidence and warmth. As the guests departed, several made pointed comments to Sebastian about what an asset his Duchess had proven to be. "You've surprised everyone," Lord Ashworth told Sebastian while Eleanor stood nearby. "Most of us thought you'd married that quiet girl for household management. Turns out she's got a political mind that rivals the best of us. You're a fortunate man, Cavendish." "I'm beginning to realize that," Sebastian replied, his eyes on Eleanor. After the last guest departed and the servants had cleared the dining room, Sebastian poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to Eleanor. "To reform," he toasted, "and to my remarkable wife, without whom tonight's success would have been far less certain." They touched glasses, and Eleanor felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the brandy. "I merely helped where I could. You did far more than that." Sebastian set down his glass and took her hands in his, a gesture that had become more frequent but still sent her pulse racing. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. During my illness, when I was delirious with fever, I truly did hear Catherine's voice. Or perhaps it was my own conscience speaking in her voice, I don't know. But she told me to let her go, to stop using her memory as a shield against living. She said—" He paused, clearly struggling with emotion. "She said that you deserved better than to be a ghost in your own home, and that I was dishonoring both of you by refusing to give our marriage a real chance." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Sebastian, I'm not there yet," he continued, his grip on her hands tightening. "I can't promise you love, at least not yet. The wounds go too deep, and healing isn't a matter of deciding to be whole again. But I can promise you respect, partnership, and genuine effort. I want our marriage to be real, Eleanor, not the hollow arrangement I forced upon you. That's all I've ever wanted." Eleanor whispered. He pulled her into an embrace then, the first time he'd held her since their wedding day, and Eleanor felt something inside her settle and warm. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had started as strangers beginning, finally, to become something more. The following morning, Sebastian made an announcement that shocked Eleanor to her core. "I'm having Catherine's portrait removed from my bedchamber," he said over breakfast. "It will be placed in the family gallery with all the other Cavendish ancestors, where it belongs. My bedchamber is my private space, and it's time it reflected my present, not my past." Eleanor set down her teacup carefully. "Are you certain? I don't want you to feel pressured. I'm certain it's time." He paused, then added, "Though I confess I would find the room less lonely if you consented to move from the guest wing to the Duchess's suite adjacent to my chambers." As husband and wife should be situated, it was the closest he'd come to suggesting any physical intimacy between them, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I would like that," she said quietly. The changes came swiftly after that. Eleanor's belongings were moved to the Duchess's suite, a beautiful set of rooms that had remained shrouded and unused since Catherine's death. The connecting door between the Duke's and Duchess's chambers was unlocked for the first time in 7 years. They didn't rush intimacy. Sebastian was still healing emotionally, and Eleanor was patient. But they began spending evenings together in her sitting room, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, slowly learning to be comfortable in each other's presence. The Tun noticed the shift. Invitations addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Cavendish arrived daily, both names given equal weight. Society columnists noted approvingly that the Duke seemed far happier this season, that his Duchess was proving to be a woman of substance, and that the couple appeared genuinely companionable. Not everyone was pleased by these developments. One afternoon in late January, Victoria called at the townhouse requesting an audience with Eleanor. Mrs. Pemberton showed her into the drawing room, where Eleanor was reviewing correspondence. "Lady Ashworth," Eleanor greeted her coolly. "This is unexpected." Victoria dispensed with pleasantries. "You've maneuvered quite cleverly, I'll give you that. Playing the devoted nurse, worming your way into his children's affections, presenting yourself as indispensable, very calculated." Eleanor set down her letter opener carefully. "Is there a purpose to this visit? Or did you simply come to insult me?" "I came to warn you." Victoria's beautiful face was hard with anger. Sebastian loved Catherine with every fibre of his being. That kind of love doesn't simply transfer to a convenient replacement. You may have his attention now, but you'll never have his heart. He's using you to move forward because society expects it, but he doesn't love you, Eleanor. He never will. The words found their mark, landing on Eleanor's deepest fears. But 3 months of building a real relationship with Sebastian had given her a foundation that Victoria's poison couldn't completely erode. "Perhaps you're right," Eleanor said steadily. "Perhaps he'll never love me the way he loved Catherine, but that doesn't mean what we're building is worthless. There are many kinds of love, Lady Ashworth, and many kinds of partnership. I'm content with what we have and hopeful about what we're becoming." "Content," Victoria sneered. "How pathetic. You're settling for scraps from a man who should have been mine." The admission hung in the air like confession. Eleanor suddenly understood. "You were in love with him, weren't you? Even when Catherine was alive." Victoria's composure cracked. "Catherine was my dearest friend, and I loved her truly. But yes, I loved Sebastian too. I loved him first, before he ever met her. But he chose her instead, and I accepted it because I wanted his happiness. When she died, I thought perhaps. But then he brought you home like some country mouse to manage his household, and I realized he'd rather marry a stranger than consider me." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a stab of sympathy. "I'm sorry, truly. Unrequited love is a terrible burden." "I don't want your pity," Victoria spat. "I want you to understand that you're living a life that should have been mine. You're raising children I should have mothered. You're sleeping in rooms where I should have been mistress." "But I'm not responsible for Sebastian's choices," Eleanor said firmly. "And neither are you. He loved Catherine. He married me out of necessity. Neither of those decisions had anything to do with you. That must be painful to accept, but it's the truth." Victoria stood abruptly, her composure restored to icy perfection. "Enjoy your hollow victory, Duchess. I hope it keeps you warm at night when you realize your husband is merely tolerating you out of duty." After she swept out, Eleanor sat for a long time, Victoria's words echoing in her mind. Was she settling? Was Sebastian merely making the best of an obligation? She didn't have answers, only the evidence of recent weeks, his growing attentiveness, his genuine smiles, the way he sought her opinion and valued her presence. That evening, when Sebastian returned from Parliament, he found Eleanor in her sitting room looking pensive. "What troubles you?" he asked immediately, having apparently learned to read her moods. She decided on honesty. "Victoria called today. She said some things that made me wonder if I'm deluding myself about us." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "What things?" "That you're tolerating me out of duty, that I'll never have your heart, that I'm merely convenient." He was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor's anxiety spiked. Then he sat beside her, taking both her hands. "Eleanor, look at me." When she met his eyes, she saw something intense there, something almost desperate. "I cannot offer you romantic declarations. I'm not a man given to flowery sentiment, and my heart is still healing from wounds that cut very deep. But I need you to understand something crucial." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "When I was dying of that fever, I felt myself slipping away, and part of me welcomed it. I was so tired of grief, so tired of pretending to function. But then I heard your voice, fierce and insistent, commanding me to live, not for your sake, but for Charlotte's and Thomas's. And I realized something. For 3 years, I'd been so consumed with honoring Catherine's memory that I'd forgotten the most important thing, being a father, being present, being alive. You reminded me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. "You saved more than my life that week," Sebastian continued. "You saved my children from losing another parent to grief, even if that grief was emotional rather than physical. You gave me a reason to truly live again. That's not tolerance, Eleanor. That's not convenience. That's gratitude, certainly, but also something more. Something I'm still learning to name." "What if it's not enough?" Eleanor whispered. "What if I've given you everything, and you can only ever give me this halfway connection?" "Then we navigate that together," Sebastian said firmly. "But I don't believe it will stay halfway. I feel myself changing, Eleanor. When I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm betraying Catherine's memory anymore. I feel like I'm honoring it by living the kind of life she would have wanted for me. Productive, meaningful, connected to others. You've given me that gift." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently. "I promise you this. I will never stop trying to be worthy of what you've given me, and perhaps in time this partnership will become something neither of us expected, something uniquely ours." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, and it was hopeful, and for Eleanor it was enough. In February, Sebastian announced they would return to Cavendish Manor for the rest of the winter. "The children have been without us long enough," he said, "and I find I miss the countryside. London is exhausting." Eleanor felt a surge of joy at the thought of returning home, and she realized with surprise that she now thought of Cavendish Manor as truly home, not a prison, but a place she loved. The children greeted their return with unrestrained delight, throwing themselves at both Sebastian and Eleanor with equal enthusiasm. "We missed you terribly," Charlotte exclaimed. "Did you bring gifts? Did you see the Queen? Tell us everything." That night, after the children were tucked into bed, still chattering excitedly, Sebastian came to Eleanor's sitting room, now redecorated to her taste with warm colors and comfortable furniture. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, not the obligatory wedding band she already wore, but a beautiful sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "This was my grandmother's," Sebastian explained. She was a remarkable woman, intelligent and strong, much like you. I want you to have it, not as the Duchess performing a duty, but as Eleanor, my wife, my partner, the woman who brought my family back to life." Eleanor slipped on the ring, and it fit perfectly. "It's beautiful. So are you," Sebastian said quietly. "I haven't told you that nearly enough." As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past months. She had entered Cavendish Manor as a duchess, only on paper, invisible and dismissed. She had endured public humiliation, soul-crushing loneliness, and the constant presence of a beloved ghost. But she had also discovered her own strength, had fought for a dying man, and won, had claimed her place in a family that hadn't known they needed her. She wasn't foolish enough to think all challenges were behind them. Sebastian still visited Catherine's memorial, still had moments of withdrawal and melancholy. Their physical relationship remained chaste, though there was increasing warmth and occasional tentative affection between them. But they were moving forward together, and that was more than Eleanor had dared hope for. She was no longer a duchess, only on paper. She was Eleanor Cavendish, a woman who had chosen her own path, who had refused to remain invisible, who had fought for her place and won not through manipulation, but through simple, steadfast devotion to what was right. And if Sebastian couldn't yet offer her passionate love, well, she had patience. She had already proven that the impossible could become possible. Who was to say that a marriage born of duty couldn't transform in time into something far more precious? The spring of 1848 arrived at Cavendish Manor with unusual warmth, as if nature herself celebrated the thaw that had occurred within those ancient walls. Eleanor stood in the newly planted rose garden, her project conceived over winter and brought to life with Sebastian's enthusiastic approval, and felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible in the dark days of her early marriage. It had been a year since Sebastian's illness, and the transformation of their household was remarkable. The children flourished under Eleanor's attentive care and Sebastian's renewed engagement as a father. Charlotte, now 11, had developed a passion for literature and would spend hours discussing novels with Eleanor. Thomas, approaching 9, had attached himself to his stepmother with devoted affection, constantly seeking her approval and praise. Sebastian himself was a changed man, not entirely. He remained serious, sometimes remote, still carried the weight of grief that would likely never fully lift. But the coldness was gone, replaced by genuine warmth. He sought Eleanor's company not from obligation, but apparent preference. They rode together in the mornings, reviewed estate business as partners in the afternoons, and spent evenings in comfortable companionship, reading or discussing the issues of the day, or simply existing peacefully in each other's presence. And 3 months ago, their marriage had finally become complete in every sense. It had happened naturally, without grand declarations or dramatic moments. One evening in late winter, as they sat together in Eleanor's sitting room, Sebastian had taken her hand and said simply, "I would like to be your husband in truth, if you're willing. I cannot promise you poetry or passionate romance, but I can offer you honesty, fidelity, and whatever capacity for love this battered heart still retains." Eleanor, her eyes filling with tears, had replied, "That is more than enough." Their physical union had been tender, slightly awkward at first, but genuine. Sebastian proved to be a thoughtful, attentive lover, and Eleanor discovered that intimacy built on respect and partnership could be as powerful as any passionate infatuation. They didn't speak of love. Sebastian wasn't ready for that word, and Eleanor wouldn't pressure him, but something deep and true was growing between them, something that felt solid and lasting. Now, on this warm April morning, Eleanor had news that both thrilled and terrified her. She was with child. Dr. Whitmore had confirmed it just yesterday, and Eleanor had spent the night lying awake, alternating between joy and anxiety. How would Sebastian react? Would he be pleased? Or would this pregnancy remind him too painfully of Catherine? Would he retreat back into grief, Or would this mark a new chapter in their life together? She heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to see Sebastian approaching, still in his riding clothes, his dark hair slightly wind-tossed. Even after all these months, the sight of him made her heart quicken slightly. This tall, reserved man who was slowly learning to live again. "There you are," he said, smiling. The smile still surprised her sometimes, how it softened his austere features and reached his grey eyes. "Mrs. Hendricks said you'd retreated to your garden. It's beautiful, Eleanor. The roses are beginning to bud." "Soon they'll bloom," Eleanor said, then decided to simply trust the moment. "Sebastian, I have something to tell you." He must have heard something in her voice, because his expression grew alert, concerned. "What is it? Are you unwell?" "No, quite the opposite." She took his hand, placed it on her still flat abdomen. "I'm with child. We're going to have a baby." Sebastian went very still, his face unreadable. Eleanor's anxiety spiked. Had she miscalculated? Had this news resurrected pain rather than joy? Then she saw tears gathering in his eyes, and he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Eleanor," he whispered against her hair, "a child, our child." "You're pleased?" she asked, needing confirmation. He drew back to look at her, and she saw his face transformed with an emotion she'd never witnessed there before, uncomplicated, profound joy. "Please" doesn't begin to cover it. I'm overwhelmed. Grateful, terrified, honored. He laughed slightly, swiping at his eyes. "Good God, I'm going to be a father again." "You're a wonderful father," Eleanor assured him. "Charlotte and Thomas adore you." "And I adore them, but I failed them for so long, lost in my own grief." He cupped her face in his hands, his expression intense. "This child, Eleanor, our child, will be born into a home filled with love, not grief. That's your doing. You've made this family whole again." We did it together," Eleanor said softly. Sebastian kissed her then, deeply, with a passion he'd previously kept restrained, and Eleanor felt herself responding with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I should have said weeks ago, but I'm a coward, and I was afraid." Eleanor's heart hammered. "What is it?" "I love you, Eleanor." The words came out rough, almost uncertain, but completely sincere. "I don't know when it happened exactly. Perhaps it was watching you fight for my life. Perhaps it was seeing you with my children, giving them the maternal love they'd been denied. Perhaps it was discovering that you have a brilliant mind and generous heart and a stubborn strength that refuses to accept defeat. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being my convenient Duchess and became essential to me. You became the person I think of first when I wake and last before I sleep. You became home." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. She'd stopped hoping for these words, had told herself that respect and partnership were sufficient. But hearing them now, she realized how deeply she'd needed them. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I've loved you for a long time, even when you couldn't see me, even when I was just a ghost in your house. I couldn't help it." "I'm so sorry it took me so long," Sebastian said, pulling her close again. "So sorry for the years I wasted being blind to what was right in front of me. You deserved better, Eleanor. You deserved to be cherished from the beginning." "We can't change the past," Eleanor said, "but we can build a beautiful future." The news of the pregnancy brought celebration throughout the household and the county. Charlotte was thrilled at the prospect of a baby sibling, already planning what she would teach the child. Thomas declared he would be the best big brother in all of England. Mrs. Hendricks and the staff moved about with proud satisfaction, as if they'd personally arranged this happy development. Letters of congratulation arrived from across the country, including a surprisingly warm note from Eleanor's mother in Bath, who wrote, "My darling girl, I knew you would find your happiness. You always had the strength to bloom wherever you were planted." One letter, however, stood out, a brief, stiff note from Lady Victoria Ashworth. "Dear Duchess, I offer my congratulations on your impending addition to the family. It seems you have achieved what you set out to accomplish. I hope you will be very happy. Yours, etc. Lady Victoria Ashworth Eleanor showed the letter to Sebastian, who read it with a grimace. Victoria came to see me before we left London, he admitted. She confessed certain feelings I'd been oblivious to for years. I told her as gently as I could that my heart was no longer available, that you owned it entirely. That must have been difficult for her, Eleanor said, and she meant it. She could afford generosity now that she'd won not through manipulation, but through simple persistence and genuine love. Victoria is a proud woman, Sebastian said. She'll recover. And perhaps she'll find someone who can offer her what she deserves, someone not still healing from old wounds. Summer arrived, and with it, Eleanor's pregnancy became visible. She bloomed, quite literally, her face glowing with health, her body ripening with new life. Sebastian was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, if she was overtaxing herself. Eleanor found it endearing, even when it bordered on excessive. One warm evening in July, the family gathered in the drawing room. Sebastian reading political papers, Charlotte practicing embroidery, Thomas building an elaborate castle with wooden blocks, and Eleanor knitting impossibly tiny clothes for the baby. It was a scene of such domestic contentment that Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Papa," Charlotte said suddenly, looking up from her work, "do you think Mamma would have liked Duchess Eleanor?" The question sent a ripple of tension through the room. Thomas stopped building. Sebastian set down his papers. Eleanor kept knitting, though her hands shook slightly. Sebastian considered the question seriously before answering. "I think your mother would have loved Eleanor very much. She would have been grateful that someone so kind and strong came into our lives when we needed her most. Your mother was never a jealous or small-minded person, Charlotte. She would have wanted me to be happy again, and she would have wanted you and Thomas to have a mother's love." "I think so too," Charlotte said thoughtfully. "I used to be afraid that liking Duchess Eleanor meant forgetting Mama, but I've realized I can love them both. Mama gave me life and love for the years she was here. Duchess Eleanor gives me love now. There's room for both in my heart." Eleanor had to set down her knitting because tears were blurring her vision. Sebastian moved to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hand. "Charlotte, that's very wise. And you're absolutely right. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies." Thomas abandoned his blocks to climb into Eleanor's lap, carefully, mindful of her growing belly. "I don't remember Mama very well," he admitted quietly. "Just feelings, mostly, being warm and safe. But Duchess Eleanor makes me feel the same way. Is that all right?" "That's more than all right, my darling," Eleanor said, stroking his hair. "Your mother loved you very much. And wherever she is, I believe she's glad you feel safe and loved now." That night, Sebastian came to Eleanor's room. They'd finally begun sharing a bed most nights, an intimacy that still felt precious and new. He held her carefully, his hand resting on her rounded belly where their child grew. "Thank you," he whispered in the darkness. "For what? For being patient with me. For fighting for a place in this family even when I tried to keep you out. For loving my children. For giving me a reason to live again. For this child. For everything." "You gave me something too," Eleanor said. "Purpose. Family. A home. And eventually, love. We've given each other new lives, Sebastian. And I wish I could go back and do it properly from the beginning," he said regretfully. "Court you, romance you, give you the wedding and honeymoon you deserved instead of that cold business transaction." "We can't go back," Eleanor agreed, "but we can move forward with intention. We can make every day from now on count." In October, exactly 4 years after their loveless wedding, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was difficult, and Sebastian paced outside her bedchamber like a caged animal, refusing to leave despite convention. When the baby's first cry rang out, he burst through the door, propriety be damned, to find Eleanor exhausted but radiant, cradling their son. "A boy," she whispered. "A perfect, beautiful boy." Sebastian knelt beside the bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he touched his son's tiny hand. "He's magnificent. You're magnificent." They named him William, after Sebastian's grandfather, with Alexander as a middle name for Eleanor's late father. Charlotte and Thomas were permitted to meet their brother that same day, both of them awestruck and tender with the tiny bundle. As Eleanor recovered over the following weeks, often with baby William in a cradle beside her bed and her family constantly visiting, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd been a girl of no particular consequence, married off to settle debts to a man who'd seen her as an obligation at best, an intrusion at worst. She'd been invisible, dismissed, publicly humiliated. She'd lived as a duchess only on paper, while being denied any real place in the family she'd been imported to serve. But she had refused to accept invisibility. She had refused to be erased. When crisis came, she had stepped forward not because anyone asked her to, but because it was right. She had saved a dying man, won over skeptical children, and slowly, patiently, carved out space for herself in a house full of ghosts. And now look at her, beloved wife of a duke who finally knew how to love again, devoted mother to 3 children, mistress of a great estate, a woman who had transformed a duty into a joy. The spring after William's birth, Eleanor stood once again in her rose garden, now in full glorious bloom, reds and pinks and whites and yellows, creating a riot of colour and scent. Sebastian found her there, as he often did, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About blooming," Eleanor said. "About how sometimes you have to be planted in difficult soil before you develop the roots that let you truly flourish. About how the hardest seasons make the most beautiful springs." "Philosophical today," Sebastian teased gently. "Your influence," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "You've made me contemplative, and you've made me happy," he said simply. "Genuinely, completely happy. I never thought I'd feel this way again." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "There were times I thought happiness was simply not my destiny, that I was meant to live forever, on the edges of other people's lives." "You're not on the edge of anything," Sebastian said firmly. "You're the center, the heart of this family, the heart of this home, the heart of my life. You showed me that it's possible to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, to carry grief without letting it consume everything. You taught me to live again, Eleanor, and for that, I will spend the rest of my life being grateful." As they stood together in the garden she'd created, surrounded by beauty, born from careful tending and patient hope, Eleanor felt a peace so profound it seemed to radiate from her bones. She had been told she was a duchess only on paper. She'd been dismissed, overlooked, made invisible in her own home, but she had persisted. She had loved when love wasn't returned. She had served when service wasn't acknowledged. She had fought for a dying man and stubborn children, and a marriage that seemed doomed from the start. And in the end, she had won not through manipulation or calculation, but through simple, stubborn devotion to doing what was right. The girl who had been married off to settle debts, the young woman who'd been told she could never replace a ghost, the Duchess existing only on paper, she had transformed into something far more real, a woman who had chosen her own destiny, who had refused to accept limitations others tried to impose, who had proven that even the coldest heart could thaw given enough patience and genuine love. She was Eleanor Cavendish, Duchess of Cavendish, not in name only, but in truth. And she had bloomed exactly where she'd been planted, turning barren ground into a garden of extraordinary beauty. If you've journeyed through this story with me, I would be truly grateful if you would take a moment to like this content, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your engagement helps these stories reach hearts across the globe, and I'm always amazed by how far they travel. Thank you for being part of this community.